Okay, well, welcome. So as people are coming in, I'll go ahead and start giving a little bit of a welcome. First, I just hope that you are all well. I know there are fires raging in parts of Reno, Nevada. So if you're in Reno like we are, I hope that you're safe and taking good care of yourself. My name is Catherine Fusco. I'm the director of the Core Humanities program in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Nevada, Reno. And I'm very pleased to be introducing the second of our two distinguished professor talks for this semester. So tonight, it's my pleasure to be introducing the Joe Crowley Distinguished Professor in the Humanities, David Rondel. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Professor Rondel, and then say a little bit about how tonight's event will proceed, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Rondel, who you are all here to see. And we were having a little bit of pre-talk chat about the Jameses who are pictured below. So my field is American literature, and Professor Rondel's is American philosophy, and so here we have it in the picture below. So Professor Rondel is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he teaches an assortment of undergraduate and graduate courses in political and legal philosophy and American pragmatism. He has also published widely in these areas. In addition to many journal articles and book chapters, he is the author of Pragmatist Egalitarianism from Oxford University Press, and the editor of two books, Pragmatism and Justice, also from Oxford, and Pessimism of the Intellect, Optimism of the Will, the Political Philosophy of Kai Nielsen. Another edited volume, The Cambridge Companion to Rorty, is scheduled to be published in May 2021 with Cambridge University Press. He is currently working on another book project, which explores connections between philosophy and anxiety. So that seems timely. I do want to say a couple of thank yous before turning things over. So I wish to thank the Crowley Foundation for endowing this professorship, and also the CH office staff, including Chris Stansel, Soha Alvi, and Maddie Rose. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn things, oh, there's a little more ado, I apologize. So the other ado is the procedure for the evening. So Professor Rondel will give his talk, and I will encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to keep an eye on those questions. And then at the end of the lecture, I will help facilitate the question asking in our brave new Zoom world. So please, as questions occur to you over the course of the talk, do go ahead and type them in the Q&A. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Professor Rondel.
Okay, wonderful. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Professor Fusco, for that warm introduction. Thank you all, to all of you at home for tuning in. I'm honored to be able to give this lecture tonight as the Joe Crowley Distinguished Professor in the Humanities. And I do want to acknowledge the Crowley family, the late Joe Crowley, and the Crowley Foundation, and also the Core Humanities program at UNR for their generosity in creating and funding this professorship. I think my mom and dad also might be tuning in from back home in Canada, so hello to them as well. Okay, well, in this talk, I want to take up a big, juicy philosophical question, which is, what, if anything, makes a human life significant? And maybe even more importantly, what would it mean for us to be able to fashion significant lives for ourselves, if indeed that's possible at all? American philosopher William James had a number of interesting reflections on this subject. And after giving you a little bit of a biographical sketch about James and his life and his work, I'll share some of his reflections with you. So it's not an embellishment to say that from the late 1880s until his death in 1910, William James was the most famous philosopher in America. Along with his brilliant and problematic friend, Charles Sanders Peirce, James was a co-founder of the quintessentially American philosophy, the philosophy of pragmatism. He was also closely associated with the founding of functional psychology in the mid-1800s. As a world-famous professor at Harvard, James taught many notable students. He was a close mentor to the great sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, the first ever African-American to receive a Ph.D. from Harvard, who recalls that he was many times a guest in James's home and praised James for, quote, being unshackled in thought and custom. One of James's extremely average undergraduate students at Harvard was a pudgy kid from New York City named Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt and James would turn out to disagree sharply about many things, most consequential of which was the imperialist foreign policy in Cuba and the Philippines that Roosevelt supported and that James loathed. One tidbit worth remembering here is that when William McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt were nominated by the Republican convention in the year 1900, James called them, quote, a combination of slime and grit that would scour anything away, even the moral sense of the country. James came from a wealthy and ludicrously talented New England family. His father, Henry James Sr., was a well-known Swedenborgian theologian. His little brother by a year, Henry James Jr., is regarded by many as one of the finest novelists ever to write in the English language. Their younger sister, Alice, was a famous diarist who, despite her tragically short life, wrote many insightful and extremely witty things about English life and manners. The great Ralph Waldo Emerson was James's godfather. I happen to think that James would have been a big fan of the Crowley Professorship public lecture in the humanities. James himself gave many public lectures throughout his career. In fact, the two essays in which James most directly explores the question of life's significance actually began as public talks that he gave to college students in the year 1898 at Bryn Mawr and Stanford University. James was a firm believer in the value of public philosophy. Good pragmatist that he was, he thought that philosophy should address questions and problems that actually matter to regular people, not just specialists with advanced degrees. A lot of professional philosophy these days occupies itself with the hair-splitting minutiae of arcane intellectual puzzles. Not all of it, but a lot of it. This was emphatically not the case for James. Deep, humanistic questions about freedom, the existence of God, about the nature of the emotions and conscious experience, about mental health and morals, were seemingly always at the center of his thinking and writing. As another pragmatist philosopher, Cornel West, sums it all up, quote, William James was the most profound and unpretentious public intellectual in American history. No one but James deserves to be considered the preeminent American man of letters. Close quote, some high praise from Cornel West. Okay, well, so much for that quick sort of biographical sketch. Now let's turn to some of James's reflections on the question, what makes a life significant? And I think to find our bearings here, it's useful to consider first a slightly different question, which is this. What would prompt someone to have doubts about the significance of their lives in the first place? Why would anyone feel that their life lacked significance? One kind of reason, I think, is brought into focus for us by the philosophy of existentialism. According to one important strand in that tradition, we human beings find ourselves living in a universe that is cold, indifferent, and godless. We're essentially purposive creatures. We're always doing or trying to do or thinking about doing something. But when we pause to reflect, it's natural to wonder about what the point of this frantic sequence of tasks and projects really is. Isn't it all just an elaborate dance ultimately leading nowhere? Won't all of it be abruptly and permanently snuffed out by our death? And when we reflect on our lives as a whole, mustn't we conclude that from a cosmic point of view, at least, they don't really matter all that much? Aren't we forced to agree with the great Scottish philosopher, David Hume, that the life of a man is of no greater significance to the universe than the life of an oyster? Measured against this cosmic standard, viewed from the point of view of the universe, it seems that even the most laudable and successful human lives come to look like trivial specks. Let's be honest, if Mahatma Gandhi or Emily Dickinson or Frederick Douglass, say, didn't live significant lives, what hope is there for my life or indeed for your life? In certain moods, James would succumb to this dark existentialist way of thinking. As he wrote in one of his most famous works, The Varieties of Religious Experience, mankind is in a position similar to that of a set of people living on a frozen lake, surrounded by cliffs over which there is no escape, yet knowing that little by little, the ice is melting and the inevitable day drawing near when the last film of it will disappear, and to be drowned ignominiously will be the human creature's portion. fun and cheerful stuff on a Tuesday night for you. Yet, in different moods, and much more frequently, James would approach the question of life significance from a decidedly individualistic point of view. I've argued in other work that this individualism is at the very heart of James's whole philosophy. And so if you'll permit me, a few words about Jamesian individualism will be helpful. So I think one of the first things that you will notice if you read James's books and essays is that he's obsessed with reversing perspectives. He's always laboring to get inside other points of view in the attempt to understand how things look and feel from there. James reflected on many kinds of lives in his writings, and virtually always from the first-person perspective of the people who lived them, whether it was rugged North Carolina mountaineers, or Hungarian laborers working underground in the subway in Boston, or well-to-do vacationers at a summer resort in Chautauqua in Western New York. He movingly tries to assume the inner point of view of those who end their own lives, recognizing sympathetically in a passage that I find quite moving, that in the deepest heart of all of us, there's a corner in which the ultimate mystery of things works sadly. That life is not worth living, the whole army of suicides declare. We too, as we sit here in our comfort, must ponder these things, for we are of one substance with these suicides, and their life is the life that we share. In a lighter moment, James even attempts to press upon his readers the inward perspective of dogs, noting how insensible each of us to all that makes life significant to the other. We to the rapture of bones under hedges or smells of trees and lampposts, they to the delights of literature and art. As you sit reading the most moving romance you ever fell upon, what sort of a judge is your fox terrier of your behavior? With all of his goodwill towards you, the nature of your conduct is absolutely excluded from his comprehension. To sit there like a senseless statue when you might be taking him to walk? What a queer disease is this that comes over you every day, of holding things and staring at them like that for hours together, paralyzed of motion and vacant of all conscious life. So while James is always urging his readers to reverse perspectives with as many people and things as possible, he's also adamant that, as he puts it, the inner significance of other lives exceeds all of our power and insight. No one's inner world is fully navigable. Every private life is partially impermeable. In every being that is real, James says, there's something external to and sacred from the grasp of every other. So just as others will never fully appreciate our inner depths, so too will we never fully understand in other people how things feel and tick on the inside. Now, I think this is powerful and humane stuff, but I also think it's the case that James would sometimes wander too far in this individualistic direction. He sometimes wrote as if all social and political problems would magically disappear if only we could put ourselves charitably in the shoes of others, to view the world from the point of view of their inner experience. If the poor and the rich could look at each other in this way, he mused, how gentle would grow their disputes, what tolerance and good humor, what willingness to live and let live would come into the world. Someone could be forgiven for thinking that this is overly simplistic. I've argued elsewhere, in fact, that James's individualism sometimes represents a paradigm case of what Karl Marx scorned as bourgeois morality, a central plank of which is the idea that all social and moral problems can be reduced to the choices and behavior of discrete men and women. James is a poster boy for the view that agency, rather than systems, is the fundamental locus of moral and political improvement. And in this respect, I think he was a spokesman for a quintessentially American cultural creed. If only we could try to place ourselves charitably in other people's shoes, if only we could be sympathetic and open-minded and humble as individuals, the world's problems would somehow wither away. Take care of decency and interpersonal kindness, the thought seems to go, and justice will take care of itself. Now, I think James is mistaken about that, but that's perhaps for another day. So, returning to our sort of core subject here, for James, the fact that the inner lives of other people are never completely graspable generates for him an imperative, an ethical imperative of tolerance. It forbids us, as he says, from pronouncing on the meaningless of forms of existence other than our own. And it commands us to tolerate, respect, and indulge in those whom we see harmlessly interested and happy in their own ways, however unintelligible they may be to us. Hands off. Neither the whole truth nor the whole of good is revealed to any single observer. So James is ultimately claiming that no one has a monopoly on wisdom about what makes a life significant, from which it follows that judgments about the significance of any individual life can only be meaningfully rendered by the person whose life it is. Okay, so far so good. But it's not enough to say that a life is significant merely if a person thinks it is, because that leaves untouched the crucial question about what it feels like on the inside for someone to think that their life is significant. What's that like? How's that supposed to feel? And how must things be going for us psychologically, emotionally, temperamentally, in order for us to feel this way about the lives we're living? James thinks that we can make headway on the question, what makes a life significant, in part by turning to the contexts in which we feel compelled to ask it. We don't typically worry about the significance of our lives when we're laughing with friends, when we're skipping down the street or enjoying a glass of wine. Rather, we tend to ask this question in times of anguish or despair or emptiness. We ask it when we confront mortality and loss, suffering and injustice. We ask it when we're reminded of our finitude. This would certainly help explain why James himself was so preoccupied with the question of life's significance. James suffered mightily with depression and anxiety, particularly during his younger years. He would describe the onset of his struggles with mental health like this, quote, "It was as if something hitherto solid gave way entirely, and I became a mass of quivering fear, a horrible dread at the pit of my stomach, a sense of the insecurity of life. It gradually faded, but for months I was unable to go out into the dark alone." Close quote. James would also battle throughout his life an assortment of other ailments and maladies, poor eyesight, insomnia, headaches, a weak stomach, and chronic back pain, among other things. As he would casually remark in a letter to a friend in 1891, "I was entirely broken down before I was 30. Okay, well, James's view about what makes a life significant finally emerges in what I'll call the formula. Having a significant life, James says, requires the conjoining, the marriage of two separate ingredients. First, a person needs one or more unhabitual ideals. An ideal is unhabitual when it's been consciously or deliberately selected, as opposed to something we might adopt unthinkingly while cruising on metaphorical autopilot, as it were. Will any such ideal do the trick? Well, here again, James defers to the point of view of the inward individual. There's nothing absolutely ideal, he says. Ideals are relative to the lives that entertain them. And of course, we also need to be epistemically humble in remembering that, as James frequently reminds us, no one has insight into all the ideals. As he made the point to an audience of students in 1899, keeping out of the gutter is for many of our brothers and sisters the most legitimately engrossing of ideals. But just having ideals is not enough on its own. The second ingredient in the formula involves what James calls strenuousness. Strenuousness requires not only that an individual have certain ideals, but also that she be willing to exert sweat and effort, as James puts it, in the attempt to bring them about, in the attempt to bring them to fruition. Failing to act in the name of one's ideals results in what James calls the sentimentalist fallacy. James is clearly impatient with people who profess certain ideals but don't do anything to try to have them be realized. There's no more contemptible type of human character, James writes, than that of the nerveless sentimentalist and dreamer who spends his life in a weltering sea of sensibility and emotion, but who never does a concrete manly deed. So having ideals is necessary for a significant life, but so too is, as James writes, courage shown, privations undergone, dirt or scars contracted in the attempt to get them realized. Mere ideals, James says, just taken on their own, taken by themselves, are the cheapest things in life. If you'll permit me a brief digression before I conclude this talk. I think it's a fascinating thing to consider just how deeply ingrained into the American psyche and the American culture this this rhetoric of strenuousness really is. American English, right, Americanese, if you will, is loaded with expressions and little bits of folk wisdom that celebrate and promote this strenuous mood. And I've got a list of some of those Americanisms, those sayings and bits of folk wisdom. I think the language of strenuousness is also a mainstay in American politics, in which it comes to connote a tough, often masculine, no-nonsense attitude. I think it's the one reason why political candidates who run for office often roll up their sleeves when they're giving a stump speech or something like that. And it was the meaning of strenuousness, after all, that was the central issue on which James and his former student, Teddy Roosevelt, disagreed. Whereas James counsels strenuousness in the name of tolerance and respect for the sacredness of all individuality, Roosevelt uses it to celebrate an imperialist foreign policy. Whereas James links strenuousness with overcoming the sentimentalist fallacy, to becoming more vigorous and more sensitive to other people's suffering, for Roosevelt, being strenuous was about manning up, about the patriotism and bravery of the Rough Riders in the Battle of San Juan Hill, about shooting rhinos on safari in Africa. But now, to conclude, a significant human life for James needs to have a deliberately chosen ideal or ideals, along with a modicum of strenuousness in trying to bring it or them about. That's it. It's really that simple. James's wager is that human lives in which these two ingredients are present will feel like significant lives to the people inhabiting them. And ultimately, as we've already seen, to feel as though one's life is significant is enough for James to make it so. Not from the point of view of the universe, right? No human life is significant from that vantage point, but rather from the inward perspective of the people whose lives they are. As James put it, quote, "Wherever a process of life communicates an eagerness to he who lives it, there the life becomes genuinely significant." Now, what if someone, though, were to protest that unless our lives can be significant from the point of view of the universe, from that most objective cosmic point of view, they can't be significant at all? James might have replied that we shouldn't assume that a cosmic perspective is the optimal one to take here. On the contrary, a perspective that's closer to the ground, closer to the reality of lived human experience might yield more wisdom in this area. After all, James might have said, to think about human life from a distinctively human point of view is not an absurd thing for a human being to do. James was not delusional about how difficult all of this can be. He knew well, and as we saw, he knew firsthand, that people from all walks of life frequently feel aimless and under-energized. Compared with what we ought to be, he wrote in 1906, we're only half awake. In the end, James was darkly realistic about human nature. He believed that we are essentially damaged creatures, inescapably prone to all sorts of sickness, darkness, and fear. And yet, at the same time, he maintained that it was possible, though of course there are never any guarantees, to fashion healthy and rewarding lives for ourselves. Suffering may be a deep and unavoidable fact of human existence, as the first noble truth of the Buddha teaches us. Yet hope for improvement springs eternal. It's always possible to become better and healthier than we presently are, more vital and more energetic, more hopeful and less susceptible to psychic suffering. In short, if James is right, a significant life is a genuine prospect for each and every last one of us. So thanks very much for tuning in tonight. I really appreciate it.
Dave, if you would unshare your screen, then everybody can see your lovely faces. I ask you their questions. So thank you so much for that talk. I have my own questions, but I'll start with other people's. So again, if folks have questions, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A and I will relay them to Professor Rondel. So we've got an anonymous question to start us off, and there's a kind of general part of it and then some specific applications. So the general question is, what is the practical upshot of forbidding us from judging against the significance of another's life? And then they have some applications. So they ask, does it imply we should be against capital punishment, abortion, eating meat?
It's a really good question. I don't know that James had views about those three sort of contemporary moral issues that are cited in that question. But one of the abiding themes, I think, in James's work is a kind of anti-imperialism. So James was very vocal, for example, in his opposition to imperialistic meddling in the Philippines. And I think one of the main reasons that he was had to do with his celebration of individuality again. I mean, to imperialistically impose oneself on someone else does violence to the sacredness of their individuality. So James certainly does believe in a kind of philosophy of live and let live. People should be free to go about their business, provided, of course, that they don't harm anyone else. I'd like to think that he might be against capital punishment. I'm not sure. I don't think there's any, he didn't write about that at all. Eating meat, that's a good question. I mean, he was fond of animals, as we saw briefly in the talk. So he might have been. But really, I think, it's a kind of a sensibility that pervades all of James's philosophy. He's deeply tolerant. That tolerance, of course, extended into sort of his views about politics and his opposition to US imperialism. He said, I want all great empires to come to hell, he said, famously in some of his notebooks. But this open-minded tolerance also, I think, extended to some of the weird views that he had philosophically. James has what some scholars and commentators refer to as a spooky side. So he loved to dabble with like nitrous oxide and other drugs. He would visit mediums in Boston and participate in seances. Fun little fact is that he and his younger brother Henry James actually made a pact with one another that whichever of the two of them died first, that they would make an attempt to sort of communicate back to the living one. So I mean, I think so. I don't know, what precisely the practical upshot is, but I think in general, what we see in James is a very open, very tolerant, very open-minded sensibility, and that that has to do with sort of an anti-imperialistic political philosophy, but also engaging in sort of the entertaining of spooky ideas as well. So it's an interesting thing to think about, though. What would his views, what might they be on these moral issues? So thank you very much for that question.
And I'm going to use my privilege as moderator to squeeze in maybe a little bit of a follow-up question ahead of Carlos's question. I was thinking, I have a literature professor's question a bit. So I was interested in the sort of perspective taking that you were talking about James engaging with. And I was fascinated by the way he kind of slips into the minds of others and the perspectives of others. And in some ways, I was surprised to hear you, and again, I'm speaking ignorantly out of field, but I was surprised to hear you talk about that in the terms of individualism, because I was thinking about the kind of joining with another. And I was wondering, just to give an example from literature, I was thinking about Walt Whitman, who's a little earlier, I think. And I was thinking about Leaves of Grass, and the way in which Whitman, who's the kind of great American democratic poet, joins with others in his poetry. So he'll, be with a slave, he'll be with a bunch of young men bathing, he'll be with various others, he'll be with a mother nursing or something like that. And so I wonder if that's a different kind of joining with others than the kind you see happening with James, or sort of what it is he, in some ways that seems very different to kind of go to an example from philosophy than like Levinas sort of like saying there's this radical difference between the self and the other, right? You've here got James slipping into the other in some ways. And so I'm just kind of curious, if you could talk a little bit more about why that's individualism and if that's different than other kinds of ways that writers have reconciled the relationship between the self and another.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and deep question. So I think that James doesn't think that the other is like utterly incomprehensible. I mean, we're all human. We're all cut from the same human cloth, and so I think James thinks that everyone is sort of partially understandable. It's possible to partially get into the shoes of other people. And James's writings are sort of packed with examples of him trying to do this. But nevertheless, it's never possible to do it entirely. As he says, a little quote that I read out in the talk itself, James says, "In every being that is real, there's something external to and sacred from the grasp of every other." So, no one is fully sort of, I guess, graspable from the inside. But James is trying, I think, to sort of enlarge his sort of sympathetic fellow feeling with as many people and things as possible. Perhaps in that sense, he belongs in the same kind of tradition as Walt Whitman, as his godfather, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who do kind of promote an individualism. They celebrate individuality. They love to focus on what the French call le vie intérieure, the interior life, right? But it's with a democratic sensibility that shot right through it, as opposed to maybe other varieties of individualism that aren't. So I think, taking a sort of 30,000 foot point of view, Whitman, Emerson, James, they're all part of that same kind of trajectory and tradition of American democratic individualism, for sure. That's a great question.
Thanks. So we've got a few questions now. So let me go to Carlos's question. So he writes, "To lead a meaningful life, one must have an ideal and strive for it. Is it possible to accomplish one's goals, or does accomplishing an ideal negate its role as an ideal?"
Great question. So Carlos, of course, is my beloved colleague in the philosophy department. Thank you for tuning in, Carlos. So it's not a meaningful life, but rather a significant one. I'm not sure what differences there are between meaningfulness and significance. Of course, ideals are accomplishable, in which case they need to be maybe refined, or we need to get new ones. I think James's thought is just that if we don't have any ideals, or if we're not exerting any sweat and effort in the attempt to bring them about, we're going to feel, inwardly, from a first person point of view, we're going to feel as though our lives are insignificant. And I think maybe some of us probably have an inkling of what that might feel like, to feel sort of a bit lost and aimless, not really sure where one should put one's energy, maybe to feel kind of fatigued and under-energized in the first place. So yeah, I think I think what he's trying to describe is, what would it feel like to feel as though one's life was significant? And so from an inward point of view, if you've got an ideal or multiple ideals, whatever they may be, and you're, going about, strenuously trying to bring them about, that's going to probably feel like on the inside as though your life is significant. You may have moments in which you sort of look up at the heavens and, think about some of those existentialist points that we were looking at in the talk. But I think his wager is that if you have those two ingredients, your life is going to feel significant. And ultimately, for a life to feel significant, is it really enough to make it so at the end of the day? But no, to Carlos's question, it's certainly possible that one can accomplish the ideals, but I bet we need to get some. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if that, like, if the process of accomplishing it, I don't know if this is, nobody gets to ask a follow-up question on Zoom. But I wonder if part of it is it seems like there's a kind of, I'm not a philosopher, so forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, but if there's a kind of like object goal, but also kind of process goal here, and that's part of the question, right? If the ideal is a kind of object, and the striving is a kind of process, if you achieve the object, you lose the striving, right? So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if there's something kind of complicated or interesting about that, but it does seem like one could end up in the position of arbitrarily changing ideals if it seems like one comes into reach, but maybe that's not the nature of an ideal, and maybe that goes to Carlos's question.
Yeah, I think we can swap them out. I think that we have those moments, don't we, where we sort of have a thought to ourselves, oh, geez, I've been striving for the wrong things all this time, or I'm going to reorient myself. It happens like around middle-age time. I'm 42 years old. You start to sort of maybe rethink some of your ideals. So absolutely, it's an unfolding. I don't think there'll ever be a point in one's life where one just says, that's it, I have no more ideals and no more striving. Or at least not a kind of inwardly healthy life for James would have that. So absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Carlos.
Yeah. And here's another anonymous question that's related to the first question you were asked. So this person writes, why does lack of insight into others' lives ground an imperative of tolerance, as opposed to, say, an imperative of mere fallibilism? Relativism doesn't imply tolerance, and it would seem that a similar situation obtains if we replace relativism with lack of insight into others' lives.
Yeah. So yeah, why does it follow that we should be tolerant? I suppose it doesn't follow logically. So, the sequence of argument is James says, I don't know what it's fundamentally like on the inside for you. And as a result, because I don't know that, I'm going to be gentle with you. I'm going to be tolerant. I'm going to respect your ways of going through the world, because after all, I don't have insight into all the ideals, and I don't really know what fundamentally makes you tick on the inside there. I don't know that it follows logically, but I think it follows kind of maybe more commonsensically, more sort of in a more everyday sense. Like if don't judge a person until you've walked a mile in their shoes. I mean, that's a very Jamesian thought. And so because we can't fully walk a mile in their shoes, we shouldn't judge them. We should, hands off is the Jamesian imperative. Let them live and let live. Let them go about their business. Don't interfere with their peculiar ways of being happy. As James writes elsewhere, I mean, even people that we find grotesque, inside for them, they have a fire going on inside, right? There's something it's like to be them, something it's like to inhabit that inward subjectivity. And I think if a person practices this kind of perspectival reversal often enough, it might tend towards an imperative of tolerance. But the point is well taken. It's not like a logical implication. Someone, I suppose, could really labor to get inside the inward perspective of other people and yet just be unmoved by it and still be a bully and still handle people roughly and so on. That's not like conceptually impossible. But the thought is that to the extent that we're able really to try to reverse perspective sympathetically with others, that's going to culminate in a kind of tolerance and goodwill towards them in general, provided they're not hurting anybody. Yeah. Thank you.
We have two questions that are a bit related in that they're asking you to think a little bit about society. So the first is an anonymous question. And the author writes, I feel as a society, we have lives more significant to others systemically. We are more diverse and open now than before. Yet we are not all equal. How can someone who is systemically less than others, or I guess treated as systemically less than others, actually feel their life is significant in James's perspective?
Well, I think everyone can feel as though their life is significant in James's perspective, no matter how downtrodden, no matter how systemically oppressed, because after all, a life is significant for James when it is felt to be so by the person whose life it is. And it's going to be felt to be so when a person has an ideal or multiple ideals and some strenuous effort. So in a way, whether or not our lives are significant has nothing to do with how we compare with others, whether we're on the sort of wrong end of injustice. I mean, so it's private, it's inward, fundamentally. But I think, maybe a kind of adjacent point that sort of was sparked for me from that question is that, I mean, isn't it important to give, don't people need like basically money and shelter and some basic necessities in order to embark on a project of fashioning for themselves a significant life? And I think that is true. I think that's true. Obviously, if someone is scrounging for their next meal and if they're always on the wrong end of injustice and bad treatment, that's gonna impede, I think, the attempt to fashion a significant life for oneself. Although James does say that the vital difference between significant and insignificant lives can't fundamentally depend on like how well off, how comparatively well-to-do a person is. There are very wealthy people, he writes, who have gone to the finest schools and have every opportunity imaginable, who nevertheless feel dark and empty inside. And similarly, there are people who were pretty downtrodden and in difficult circumstances, objectively bad circumstances, who have a kind of cheerful inward disposition. So fundamentally, James says, even though it's important, sort of the welfare state is important for people's ability to fashion significant lives for themselves, fundamentally, at the end of the day, James would say it's going to be an inward question. That's going to carry the day.
There is an interesting follow-up question that just popped up, which I was curious about too, because I was just interested about how much this is a kind of, in terms that I would understand, a project of kind of habits in some ways, right? These are, habits or behaviors, or, in kind of layperson's terms, you could understand them as almost like, these are like, you can imagine sort of like podcast bros being like, in 2020, pick an ideal and strenuously pursue it, right? Like, this is like what you're gonna do. But one of our attendees has asked a question that is the kind of thing that I think I'm suggesting here, which is that if James's view only leads to someone feeling significant, then what is the significance of James's ideas? If someone is only feeling that their life is significant, well, this person is sort of judgmental a little bit when they ask the question, then they are only deceiving themselves, right? So, or it's possible, right, that one is, right, if I pick a sort of frivolous ideal or something, or,
yeah, I mean, so, yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And just to your earlier point, Catherine, I think James is ripe for podcast bro appropriation. I think that's right. Like the Stoics, like Buddhist philosophy of a certain kind of Americanized stripe as well. So I think, yeah, that there's that possibility, that danger. But okay, I love this question. Thank you so much for that. I think basically the question is, can't we be wrong? I mean, if the final arbiter of whether or not a life is significant is the person whose life it is, with ideals and strenuous striving, is it impossible for us to be mistaken? I mean, we could imagine, like, what if my ideal in life was like to, go around and like scrape gum off of furniture, and that was it. And I wanted to be like the best gum scraper, and I exerted so much effort to that end. And someone might sort of look at my life and say, you're wildly out of touch. You're delusional. You're, as the questioner puts it, you're deceiving yourself. So I think that's a really deep and important question. And the critique is, and it's, other people have critiqued James on this, that he's too subjective about this. I think, if I can imagine how James might reply, I think he'd say something like this. Well, objective significance of a life from the point of view of the universe, that's off the table. From the point of view of the universe, our lives just aren't significant. Sorry, we're going to live for 90 years, and yes, our lives don't really matter from that point of view. Okay, well, what about a human point of view? Can't we make mistakes? I think that we can make mistakes. I think in our own lives we recognize when we've maybe been sort of in pursuit of a bad ideal or a faulty ideal, or an ideal that was illusory in some sense, and maybe we can reorient ourselves. Maybe our friends can sort of weigh in and say, hey, you're really not living in the name of a good ideal. I mean, all of that's possible. So we can, like, correct errors, so to speak. But I think James would say that those kinds of discoveries of errors would themselves only really ever come about from that personal inward point of view, right? It's not like there are, maybe there are objective facts, like, as philosophers like to say, facts of the matter about what makes a life significant. But we don't know in a final, decisive way what they are. And since we don't, this is kind of the best that we can do, I guess. So yeah, I guess it's possible that there are, right, objective facts about what makes a human life significant. But if cosmic significance is off the table, then what's left except how our lives feel to us? But it's a deep critique, I do want to say to the questioner. And there are philosophers who have sort of pressed James on precisely this issue. It's too subjective. It's merely about feeling significant, but not about significance. But I think maybe if I could take James's view, and sort of push back, what else could there be? If cosmic significance is off the table, what else would it mean except feeling a certain way about the life that is yours? But
Well,
great.
yeah, I mean, it does seem like also to give the James that you present here some credit too, that the strenuous part of the formula also should in some ways help with that, right? If you are strenuously pursuing an ideal, you would be bumping up against critiques of the ideal perhaps, or things that might challenge the ideal in some way if your pursuit is truly strenuous.
Yeah. But the point of delusion is important. I think my parents are probably on the call, or they said they were going to be, but they'll know that
Rondel.
back home in my hometown of Toronto, there was a homeless man who kind of became famous. He lived sort of under a ravine near a highway, and you would see him. He was sort of in the news. He was kind of like a popularly well-known figure who was in earnest training for the Olympics, and he was an old man. And you'd see him sort of running, like carrying like a heavy stone or something. He was like training himself. And I think, there's an inclination to say that's completely delusional. You're not living your life in accordance with a good or realistic or proper ideal. To which I think James would reply, we don't know what's going on the inside in that life of his, and we hands off. We shouldn't assume we know better. But I take the point. It's a powerful critique of James's view, I think.
We've got, I think, 2 more questions to round out the evening. So we've got one from Christopher Klopp. Is that, this questioner?
Yes, this is my former MA student who wrote a wonderful, superb MA thesis in philosophy on defending a right to a home, that having a home should be a right. And it was a wonderful piece of work.
Well, he has a question for you. So
Sure.
The question is, with James's very tolerant views in mind, and largely at the center of this conversation, how does James deal with areas in which society develops policies that try to nudge or push people to behave in a certain way, or even prescribe behavior?
Okay, so let me just have a look at that one again.
Yeah,
How does
sure.
it deal with areas in which society develops policies that try to... Yeah, well, I mean, I think that maybe goes back to his strident anti-imperialism. The worst thing about the United States meddling in the Philippines was that it does violence to the individuality of the Filipinos, as he says. There's a wonderful essay that he wrote in 1899 called "The Philippine Tangle." It was for a Boston newspaper, and he's at his most angry there. That's like the worst thing that we can do. And so, he was also very vocal in an anti-lynching campaign. So he was like sort of politically active. He wasn't sort of disposed to kind of getting up on soapboxes and being that vocal. I mean, I guess his primary interests were kind of inward ones. But he was like what we would call like sort of a liberal. And so I think, so how does he deal with areas in which we develop policies? I mean, I think he would generally be against policies that try to push or nudge people to behave in a certain way, that try to kind of, well, yeah, when he said nudge, now I'm thinking about the sort of the libertarian paternalism of Cass Sunstein. Yeah, I don't know if he would have an opinion on that. But no, I think the general inclination would be to leave people alone, really. Don't mess with them. Don't meddle with their lives. Don't impose some ideal on them. So again, issue by issue, we would have to kind of maybe sort of try to figure out how James would come down on it. But that would be the general inclination of his, I think. But that's a great question. And hello, Christopher. Thanks for tuning in.
And I think we're just going to take one more question from, there's some good questions though. So maybe we could take 2 if that's all right. So James Bondarchuk asks, how existential does James get? Does he ever, for example, find a kind of subjective significance in courageously facing his own objective insignificance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think James is an American existentialist. I think he's part of that tradition. And I read one passage from the Varieties of Religious Experience that conveys some of that. Yeah, I think he does get pretty existentialist in that way. He's particularly in his writings on religion, often thinking about his own objective insignificance. In fact, he thinks one of the things that draw people to religion in massive numbers, as we know, is precisely that it gives to them an account of their objective significance rather than objective insignificance. So yeah, look, I think James ultimately would say we don't know whether our lives can be objectively significant. That's beyond our, that's a hypothesis that we can't test in any way, and so on. But to kind of get to the nub of James's question, I think it's something he does frequently. He has many sort of existentialist moods in his writings. Maybe the kind of preeminent American existentialist in a certain way. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that question.
So our final two questions, I'm actually going to kind of bundle together as asking questions that we might broadly construe as being about sort of unhappy states. So the shorter question is, can one achieve significance while pursuing an immoral ideal? And then the longer question that I think can kind of be bundled with that one is, to what extent is being miserable, tortured, etc., compatible with having significance in a life? It may be better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, but are there limits to dissatisfaction, right? So we've got people asking about unhappiness, immorality, behaving like a pig versus being Socrates. So
that's right. That's right. So maybe I'll take the second one first about whether one can achieve significance in their life while pursuing an immoral ideal. I think for James, the answer is absolutely yes. So significance is one thing, and a moral life is a separate thing altogether. So Adolf Hitler probably led a significant life insofar as he had ideals, monstrous ones, and too strenuously worked to bring them about. So from that point of view, even Adolf Hitler had a significant life. That doesn't mean he had a moral life. Of course, that's so. I think yes, we want to partition for James a significant life from a moral life, or a life lived in accordance with some kind of morally attractive ideal. So I think that one is more straightforward. The other one, to what extent is being miserable compatible with having a significant life? I mean, I suppose there are some ideals that one could adopt that require one to endure pain and suffering and to go through periods of misery. So that's, I think, not ultimately a problem for James. I think he might even think, sort of ideals aside, that there's some misery in every human life. Every human life has pain in it and suffering. There, James and the Buddha agree that that's just a feature of human life. So it's not that a significant life will just be bubbly and cheerful, right, all the time. There are going to be, James believes this is just deep in our nature, deep in what he calls our sick soul. There are going to be moments and periods of heartache and sadness and melancholy and fear. That's just part of that's the kind of creature we are, according to James. But nevertheless, even with that, we can still fashion significant lives for ourselves, again, by abiding by the formula, right? Having an unhabitual ideal or multiple ideals and exerting some strenuous effort to try to bring it or them about. Yeah. Great questions, though. Thank you so much for those.
Yeah, and thank you for answering them. I feel like, this is a good talk for our time, right? Where we have so much time alone that not a bad time to contemplate one's ideals, perhaps.
Yes,
So I think that will wrap us up for the evening, though. So I want to thank everybody for coming out and encourage you all to stay safe and take care of yourselves and one another. And thank you to Professor Rondel for giving this wonderful talk.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
All right, take care, everyone. Good night.